Oh, near zero? So what am I, stupid? You got negative interest rates. So this is a whole scam because these liars, these little freaks, the central banksters were BSing us for how many years? That when inflation hits around 2%, we will be raising interest rates. 2%. Oh, what happened today? What's the number that came out? Wholesale price measures rose 9.6% in November, the fastest pace on record. This is a crime syndicate. It's Christmas time coming up, right?
Right.
There was a story about a person by the name of Jesus Christ. One day, he drives the banksters out of the temple, the money changers, the Goldman Sachs gang, the JP Morgan Chase bandits. Oh, JP Morgan Chase, you mean the one that rigged the precious metals market and only got fined $900 million? Oh, yeah, those banksters. Nothing has changed. And by the way, 3 days later, he's up on the cross. So you don't screw with the banksters.
It's amazing we're still alive here.
Yeah, I know.
Building. Now, that was a 20-year charter also, so it ran until 1836. Well, guess who was president in 1836? Andrew Jackson. And he hated the central banks. And he came from Tennessee. He campaigned to shut down the central banks. Well, it was one of the biggest, fights in history. Would the Congress reauthorize it or not? He vetoed it. And so the second Bank of the United States ended in 1836. So 2 tries, 2 failures. We had no central bank from 1836 to 1913. There was no central bank. And that was one of the, as you point out, Robert, one of the greatest periods of prosperity in American history. I mean, the telegraph, the telephone, the electricity, the automobile, I guess the airplane kind of came along at the tail end of that. Harvesters, machinery, ocean shipping, steam, you name railroads, you name it. I mean, we just grew and grew and grew from coast to coast.
You go back into why we have 3 Feds. There have been 3 Feds. The greatest prosperity was between the second and third Fed. And why do we have the third Fed?
Right. Well, you can say we had 3 Feds. We actually had 3 central banks, but one of them was called the Fed because they didn't want people to know. But there was a reason for that, Robert. You make a good point because they didn't want people to know it was a central bank. Yes, the Fed is our third try. So the first Bank of the United States, I think it was kind of 1797 to 1816. It had a 20-year charter, so it went from the late 1790s to around 1814, give or take. And then they shut it down. They said, well, we don't need this. This is concentrating all the, it was actually based in Philadelphia, concentrated too much power in Philadelphia, the Eastern merchants and all that. So they let the charter expire. Well, then we got, then it was kind of a hangover from the War of 1812, and we needed finance, and trade was disrupted, et cetera. So I guess the first bank ended around 1812, but then after the war, we needed a new one. So they chartered a new one in 1816, and that was called the Second Bank of the United States, also a central bank on, I think, Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. The building's still there. It's a beautiful old building. Now, that was a 20-year charter also, so it ran until 1836. Well, guess who was president in 1836? Andrew Jackson. And he hated the central banks. And he came from Tennessee. He campaigned to shut down the central banks. Well, it was one of the biggest, fights in history. Would the Congress reauthorize it or not? He vetoed it. And so the Second Bank of the United States ended in 1836. So 2 tries, 2 failures. We had no central bank from 1836 to 1913. There was no central bank. And that was one of the, as you point out, Robert, one of the greatest periods of prosperity in American history. I mean, the telegraph, the telephone, the electricity, the automobile, I guess the airplane kind of came along at the tail end of that. Harvesters, machinery, ocean shipping, steam, you name railroads, you name it. I mean, we just grew and grew and grew from coast to coast, massively productive. Inflation was not a problem. Actually, deflation was a problem, but it was kind of a good kind of deflation where, when prices go down, if you make the same amount of money, you get a raise. You can buy more for your money. What's wrong with that when you think about it? So why 1913? Why all of a sudden did we want to bring back the central bank? Well, it goes back to the San Francisco earthquake in 1906, devastating, of course. And so what happened was there were insurance claims. Everyone's building got, wiped out, knocked down, or burned out because it was huge fires, put in insurance claims. So the insurance companies had to sell assets in the eastern markets. They had to sell stocks and bonds to get the cash to pay the claims in San Francisco. That created financial pressure in New York. And then throw in a couple of frauds. There was a panic with the Knickerbocker Trust. It was financing a corner of a copper market that blew up. Corners usually do. Anyway, there was a financial panic and there was no central bank. So what happened? Pierpont Morgan, everyone turned to Pierpont Morgan, the original JP Morgan. And he got all the bankers in his townhouse in Murray Hill around 35th Street and Madison Avenue in Manhattan. And he sent actually Benjamin Strong, who later became president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, out to audit all the banks in New York. And they did triage. And they broke the banks into three categories. They said, okay, you're strong enough to weather the storm. You're okay. This category, you're broke, you're insolvent, you're hopeless, we're going to let you go. And there was a middle category where they were not insolvent, but they were illiquid. So what they said is, okay, the strong banks lend money to these banks. That'll prop them up. We'll keep them open, and these guys will let them fall off a cliff. And they locked the bankers. He had the servants bolt the doors. So the bank, and then made us stay up all night. He bolted in like, so you're not getting out until you come up with an answer. And they stayed up all night. He knocked on the door and they answered. We got an answer, and they came out. And they did exactly what I just described. Well, it worked, and the panic was over, and the banks survived. But they didn't mind shutting down banks in those days. They don't anymore. But there were a large number of banks, a large number of depositors lost money. But they said, well, let's be more careful about your bank next time. But what happened was, Pierpont Morgan died not long after that, and the bankers, the Rockefeller interests, the Stillmans, the Morgan interests, said, well, this is going to happen again because bankers are dopes and they do it every 10 years like clockwork, and we're not going to have Pierpont Morgan around the next time. So there's nobody like him. So we need a central bank. We need a printing press, basically. And they cooked up the idea for what became the Federal Reserve. But they knew that Americans hated central banks, and they do. They still do. So they said, well, don't call it a central bank. Call it the Federal Reserve. It sounds like a brand of whiskey, It's like aged Federal Reserve. But they call it the Federal Reserve and have a board of governors and break it into 12 regions so it doesn't look too ominous. And they did all these gimmicks to basically make it not look like a central bank, even though it was. And the original purpose of the central bank, it really only had one purpose: lender of last resort. So next time there's a panic, like the panic of 1907, your job is to lend to illiquid institutions, not insolvent institutions, illiquid institutions. And Walter Bagehot, 19th century writer, sort of had written the playbook for central banking in the mid-19th century. And he said a central bank in a financial crisis should do three things: lend freely to solvent institutions at a punitive rate. Turn the money spigot on, crank up the printing press, lend freely, but only to people who are solvent. Do not lend to the insolvent, let them fall by the wayside. And a punitive rate to teach them a lesson, okay? Now, what did Ben Bernanke do in 2007? Well, he lent freely. We know that, to increase the balance sheet by $4 trillion. But to solvent and insolvent alike, they lent to everybody. AIG wasn't solvent. Half the banks on Wall Street weren't solvent, but they lent to them anyway. So they didn't follow Bagehot's number 2 rule. They lent to insolvent institutions, and it was not a punitive rate. It was close to zero. So Bernanke broke 2 of the 3 rules. He lent freely, but he lent to everybody, wasn't selective, and he lent at a zero rate. Well, that just means that, you got through it, but you just propped up a bunch of insolvent institutions and set them up for the next time. And, 2020 was different. 2020 was a an economic crash. It was not a financial crisis. We did not have a financial crisis in 2020. We probably will the next time. But so the point is, we have a central bank for all the wrong reasons. But the real problem is that in 1934, during the Roosevelt administration, they reneged on the original Fed deal. They pulled all the power from the regions and put it back in Washington, where it is today. And then in the 1970s, I think 1979 or thereabouts, in Humphrey Hawkins' bill, they expanded the mandate of the central bank. It was no longer just price stability, which it always had been. Well, the stated mission was price stability. The real mission is bail out the banks. That's what you're there for. The stated mission was price stability. Okay, we don't want too much inflation. But they added a third mission, which was full employment. Well, mission 2 and 3 are inconsistent. A lot of times what you need to do to get price stability doesn't necessarily give you full employment, and vice versa. Full employment might mean inflation, which is inconsistent with goal number 2. So we've given, and now, by the way, now the central bank, the Fed has a fourth mission, which is climate change. And that's another, we can spend a couple hours on that, Robert. We don't have to, but they're going to basically, they can't run the Exxon, you know. So,
it's like I said, Jim, you know, behind your back, we all call you the fire hose because you can't, I mean, I don't know how you do it with all that information.
Well, I'll wrap up. Here's what I'll do with central banks. That the Fed is, I'll say, always wrong. It is, you know, I do a lot of economic forecasting, have models, but one of the best factors is if the Fed has a forecast, it's wrong. If you assume the opposite or certainly significantly reduced, you'll probably be very close to a strong prediction. And I got nervous last summer because, as I just explained earlier, Robert and Kim, I'm expecting disinflation, not strong inflation.
Right.